The Great Famine, a dark chapter in European history, unfolded in the early 1930s across the former Soviet Union. Its devastating impact claimed the lives of millions of people in various regions, including Belarus, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Russia, and most notably Ukraine. Ukraine, the nation that bore the brunt of this tragedy, these haunting events are known as Holodomor, a term that signifies the man-made famine. Recognized by Ukrainian law as an act of genocide against Ukrainians, the memory of those who perished during this time must never be forgotten. To understand the context of the Great Famine, we need to delve into the general historical background of the Soviet Union during the late 1920s and early 1930s. In December 1927, the Soviet leadership made a significant shift in their economic policy. They abandoned the new economic policy, which was introduced by Lenin after the Civil War, and embarked on a path of rapid industrialization. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the goal was to transform the primarily agrarian nation into an industrial superpower within a short span of time. This ambitious industrialization required immense resources. While human resources could be found within the country, the Soviet Union heavily relied on importing machinery and technologies from abroad. To acquire the necessary foreign currency for imports, the Soviet Union decided to increase grain exports to the West. Agricultural production became a vital internal resource for the Soviet leadership. However, it's crucial to note that this policy coincided with the severe economic crisis that had gripped the Western countries since 1929. The industrialized nations were eager to sell their products, particularly heavy machinery, to the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, the Soviet agricultural policy underwent drastic changes. The previous policy, allowing peasants to sell their surpluses on the open market, was abandoned. In 1928, the policy of collectivization was introduced, replacing individual privately owned farms with collective farms called kolkhozes. Peasants who joined the kolkhozes had to relinquish their private land and property. The state set low prices for the kolkhoz produce, which was then sold to meet the state's needs. Initially, the progress of collectivization was gradual. However, in November 1929, the Soviet leadership implemented accelerated and forced collectivization. This intensified collectivization aimed to increase agricultural production, free up the workforce for industrial purposes, and enable the state to requisition food. But it also had a political goal: the elimination of private agricultural property, and the class of land-owning farmers known as kulaks. Anyone opposing collectivization was labeled a kulak. Stalin himself formulated the policy to liquidate the kulaks as a class, leading to the execution or deportation of hundreds of thousands of farmers and their families. The Soviet policies of collectivization and grain procurement had disastrous consequences, contrary to the expectations of the Soviet leaders. Starting from 1929 to 30, farming productivity plummeted, while the state's demands for grain procurement increased significantly to fulfill export commitments. The famine initially began in 1929, affecting the grain-producing regions of Russia and Kazakhstan, which was then an autonomous republic of Russia. By 1932, food requisitioning intensified, especially in the main grain-producing regions, as unattainable grain procurement quotas were imposed. The combination of decreased production due to collectivization, a poor harvest in 1932, and the forceful requisitioning of grain and foodstuffs resulted in the Great Famine. The full extent of the tragedy remains difficult to ascertain. In Ukraine alone, various researchers estimate the number of victims to be between 2 and 7 million. According to recent estimates by Ukrainian researchers, the death toll in Ukraine rose from 205,000 in 1932 to 3.6 million in 1933. In Kazakhstan, an estimated 1.5 to 1.8 million out of the 4 million population perished. Millions more are believed to have died in different parts of Russia. Despite knowledge of the harsh famine, the Soviet leadership persisted in their policies. They enforced grain and food procurement plans at any cost, resorting to repression and the use of force against civilian peasants during the requisitioning process. The Soviet regime went to great lengths to conceal information about the famine, both domestically and abroad. Foreign journalists were denied access to the affected areas, and only a few articles in the international press shed light on this disaster. However, there were indications that Western governments were aware of the famine in the USSR, yet they continued to purchase cheap Soviet grain, disregarding the millions of lives it cost. Diplomats stationed in the USSR began reporting to their capitals as early as 1930 about the impending famine. In October 1933, the Council of the League of Nations requested information from the Soviet authorities regarding the famine in Ukraine and the North Caucasus, but this request was rejected. The Great Famine finally came to an end in 1933 after the Soviet leadership decided to halt grain exports. However, the repercussions of hunger and disease continued to claim lives. The demographic losses suffered by the former Soviet republics were immense, and were further compounded by the mass terror of the late 1930s and the ravages of the Second World War. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union, accounted for a significant portion of the Soviet Union's grain production. In the 1930s, approximately 70% of Soviet grain exports originated from Ukraine and the North Caucasus region of Russia. This tragic event, known as the Holodomor, was characterized by artificial famine and the deliberate withholding of food, leading to the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. To enforce grain procurement, extraordinary commissions were established, and thousands of rural communists and farmers from Ukraine and the North Caucasus were sent to the Gulag camps. Despite these efforts, the quotas remained unmet. The regime then resorted to the total requisition of all grain and foodstuffs, sealing the peasants' fate with inevitable death. The regime implemented blackboards, publishing lists of villages that failed to meet grain procurement quotas. These villages were denied external assistance, ensuring their demise. Desperate peasants attempting to escape famine by migrating to cities or other regions were met with orders to halt their departure, with the Red Army erecting blockades to capture and return them to their villages. Among the most harrowing aspects of the Holodomor were acts of cannibalism and corpse eating. Survivors and eyewitnesses shared their stories, and archived criminal cases on cannibalism were consulted. In Belarus, the Great Famine does not hold the same political significance as in Ukraine. While the country did experience famine, it was not as severe as in grain-producing areas. The southern regions of Belarus, however, saw the death of tens of thousands of peasants due to hunger. Cases of cannibalism were reported in Belarus, albeit on a smaller scale. Unlike in Ukraine, there were no instances of village blockades. Testimonies from eyewitnesses suggest that the administrative border with Ukraine remained open during 1932–33, allowing exchanges between relatives living on both sides. In Belarus, the tragedy of the Great Famine is often overshadowed by the immense loss suffered during World War II, where the country lost a quarter of its population. Various researchers in Kazakhstan provide different estimates of the tragedy, ranging from 1.4 to 1.8 million victims. Some argue that the losses constituted around 40% of the Kazakh population, making Kazakhstan the republic that suffered the most in proportion to its population, even more so than Ukraine or other affected regions of Russia. Kazakhstan had a nomadic population that relied on livestock. The Soviet authorities enforced a policy of forceful collectivization, compelling the Kazakh people to settle down, grow crops, and confiscate their livestock for the benefit of industrial centers. As a result, the livestock population decreased from 40 million to 4 million between 1932 and 1933. Stavropol, among the areas in Russia most affected by collectivization and the mass famine, witnessed the tragedy in 44 out of its 75 districts. The estimated death toll in the Stavropol region ranges between 75,000 and 100,000, with a 20% decline in the rural population between 1926 and 1937. Russian historians emphasize the similarity between events in Ukraine and the grain-producing regions of Russia. They argue that the regime employed the same machinery of terror and violence to implement its policies across the Soviet Union. As the grain procurement plans failed, repression and violence against peasants increased. From autumn 1932, villages in all grain-producing regions were forced to surrender their last food reserves. In the Moscow archives, documents were found revealing the grim realities of the famine, including reports of cannibalism and orders to restrict bread migration in Ukraine and other areas. These accessible documents shed light on the suffering of the Kazakhs, resorting to consuming garbage and wild plants to survive. mass migration to cities and settlements led to outbreaks of diseases, causing further loss of life. The native population of Kazakhstan endured hardships, with many forced to seek refuge in neighboring countries. Recognizing the magnitude of the tragedy, parliamentary resolutions acknowledged the millions of lives lost in Belarus, Moldova, Russia, and Ukraine due to deliberate actions of the Soviet regime. Ongoing research and international collaboration aim to uncover the truth and raise awareness, fostering an unbiased understanding of this human catastrophe.